Hello and welcome to Pluribus Unum's Fireside Chat. Not as good as a few hours, but hey, it's something. Now, this week is going to be quite an interesting week because, I don't necessarily want to give it all away, but I will say, this week, you better make sure those notifications are on this week because, I guess I will just say it. This week is going to be packed with content. It's going to be packed with quite a lot of content. Monday, you get a podcast. On Tuesday, you get a very special episode of my reaction to Andor. Of course, Thursday is the regularly scheduled video, but Wednesday, if you've been paying attention to my channel, you'll know that Wednesday is the official 5-year anniversary of me making and uploading content on this channel. That's going to be the 5th year anniversary of my first video. So, naturally, there has to be some form of celebration, right? And before you ask, no, it's not going to be a live stream. I don't really trust myself with live streams because live streams and me, if you know the history of this channel, don't really mix. But you will get something, wink wink, nudge nudge. Also, while I'm here, I should say this. We are really close to hitting 900 subscribers. It would be really cool if we hit 900 subs before the Wednesday deadline. Is it realistic? Probably not, but it would be cool if we did. My goal is that 1K by the end of the year. That's the one thing, 1K by the end of the year. And then for those 1K to actually give some money to me on Patreon. But before we have any time to ramble about that, let's get right into the news. First, Paraguay. The day before my podcast on, the last podcast came out, Paraguay election results came in. Sad to say, the Paraguayan conservatives won. This was a pretty simple and obvious one that was going to happen. It was pretty clear that the Colombia party was going to win. Everybody knew this. There was some slight hope that maybe Alegre could pull it off at the last second, but when push came to shove, it just didn't work. The Paraguayan Colombia party, they've literally held so much power in Paraguay for so long that legitimately you really need a miracle for that to happen. And Fernando Lugo happened to do that one time, but unfortunately, that magic just can't be repeated apparently. However, almost immediately after the election results came in, Paraguayo Cubas announced that, surprisingly, he didn't accept the results of the election and called for an election audit. Basically saying, the elections were rigged, and tacitly implying that he would have been the winner. Even though, realistically, he wouldn't have been the winner. Realistically, it would have been Alegre who would have actually pulled it off. But, yeah, it's one of those things, of course the elections are rigged, but it's what type of rigging is it? It's not like push comes to shove, it's rigged, but it's the Colombian party just has so much power that it is so collectively combined that they have so much power to topple. Unfortunately, you need to build a long-standing political movement to actually even manage to topple them, and unfortunately, Alegre, who's literally been doing that, even he can't do it. And Cubas has actually been inciting riots all across the nation to protest the election results and try to push for new elections, or at the very least just to audit the elections and look into them. But unfortunately, he ain't really doing so hot, considering just today, the 5th, as I'm recording this, Cinco de Mayo, he is going to jail for obviously inciting riots. There ain't much else to say about that. This far-right guy is basically puppeting the far-right talking point all across the world, so yeah. But speaking of actual election rigging, we're going to be talking about the Guatemalan election because, sadly, we've gotten it seems like this is the final nail in the coffin for the Guatemalan election story. Thelma, Cabrera, and Jordan Rodas are officially out of the upcoming elections. The Constitutional Court of Guatemala Like, they looked at their appeal and they just said, no, we're not accepting your appeal, and you will not be on the ballot in this upcoming election. In fact, I think from what I've seen of people talking about this on Twitter, people have been posting pictures of the ballot with all the candidates crossed out, with them writing like Jordan Rojas and Thelma Cabrera, which I'm pretty sure if those are the real ballots, which I'm pretty sure they are, then that means, yeah, that's it. It's over. In fact, I even just looked up on Twitter to see, like, is this true? Because, like, the website that I looked at it from, it was gone. So then I was like, okay, maybe it was, like, a false story. But then it looks like Thelma Cabrera is officially calling on people to vote blank in the upcoming election, basically signifying that she is done with this electoral process. Quite unfortunate. And also quite unfortunate is the failure of indie left media to even talk about this. Even our foreign policy experts, even our Latin America experts, everybody just flat out refused to talk about this story, with the exception of me. Even with Progressive International loudly proclaiming that this story should be talked about, unfortunately, I'm the only one who actually cares about a growing left in the world, apparently. Like, honestly, truthfully, there truly is not much else to say, because for a lot of reasons, this is bad. For starters, just the obvious kicking a candidate off the ballot that should be on the ballot is bad. But also, this is bad for, again, the worldwide left, because she is literally the only left-wing candidate that actually has a chance of winning the upcoming Guatemalan election. Now you might say, polls indicated that she wasn't doing so hot. Well, as I've mentioned before, and I'll mention again in the future, if anybody even talks about this subject, I'll greatly make point to mention this. She underpolls in the polls, but when election day comes, she gets a huge shoot in support. Like, in the previous election, she was getting like 5% of the vote, and then she left the election with like 10% of the vote. Like, almost double. Like, I think double or more. It was like 10, 11, 12, like something like that line. She was like in 4th place, even though she was polling in like 6th or 7th. And this election had her polling at the levels that she was getting the last election, so I theorized that there would be a similar bump in support for her, which would put her very much over the top. But unfortunately, we will never know, because she's been kicked off the ballot. And again, all these big-name progressive voices on the left sphere, Secular Talk, Humanist Report, Bannon, Banato, Vosh, Dylan Burns, like, all of you failed. Like, you all failed. I know that I should just already accept that you guys aren't going to do much for actual left-wing action, aside from bitching and moaning and getting into fights on Twitter. Like these guys... Imagine if the freaking Marianne Williamson people... I know this is weird tangent, but like, imagine if the freaking Marianne Williamson people brought this issue to attention much more than freaking Marianne Williamson. They'd rather go to their funny little distractions, the dramas, the freaking Marianne Williamsons, the force the votes. They want to do that. They don't want to actually focus on actual important things that are going on in the world. It's honestly just depressing. Speaking of things that are depressing, for people who are not me, because I didn't really care about this person at all, Noam Chomsky was on Epstein's flight list. It is kind of just funny thinking that. Like, Noam Chomsky was apparently on the Epstein flight plans. Like, literally, it was revealed, like, in a recent, like, thing of personal documents about, like, from Epstein, which showed schedules from 2013 to 2017, showing that he met with many prominent individuals after his 2008 conviction, which included but was not limited to CIA Director William Burns, former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, filmmaker Woody Allen, former Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers, and Noam Chomsky. Chomsky confirmed that he did know Epstein, and he wrote an email basically saying, like, basically his email was that it was basically none of their business what he was doing with Epstein, and that he didn't regret meeting Epstein. And now many people, I'm sure that the Chomsky stands might go in the comments and be like, he wasn't on the Lolita Express. It's like, dude, isn't that the same excuse that half of these guys did? Like, look, guys, I knew him But I didn't go on that plane. I didn't go on that one. Bro, it doesn't matter. The meme writes itself, dude. I literally, made a meme, immediately after I found out, where it's just, a clip from the show Clone High, where it's, the Abraham Lincoln character. He's like, don't get on that plane. I mean, I could sit here and laugh about it, because I didn't really, hold Chomsky to this, super high standard. I didn't really care about Chomsky. And there might be, some discussion about, are the allegations true? Is he actually, a creep or whatever? But it's you gotta know, he is from an era where, certain things were a bit different. Another prominent thinker at the time, Allen Ginsberg, who was in sort of, the same sort of field of Chomsky, left-ish politics, anti-Vietnam War activism being, where they kind of got their beginning. And Ginsberg, well-known creep, very well-known creep. And he made sort of similar things in regards to, associations with certain groups and people, where he was just trying to brush it off. Then people who knew them more intimately were no, I want to be upfront and say things, but it's I don't know if I should, considering certain, I don't know if certain buzzwords might get, certain attentions of certain algorithms, but, Allen Ginsberg was a member of a certain organization, and he claimed that he was a member of said certain organization because he was for free speech and believed that certain people should have the right to speak freely about certain issues, about certain things, but then also privately admitted that he engaged in the certain activity that this group advocated for. Not saying that Chomsky is the exact same as him, but I'm just saying they're sort of in the same era and sort of from the same political ilk, but Chomsky's of course a bit more radical than him, I think. Just saying, don't be shocked if an actual revelation comes out. But anyways, let's move on from that big, bad thing and move on to something that's a lot more positive. Senator Bernie Sanders introduces a $17 minimum wage bill. Very interesting development. Consider it, this is, again, a big sign for a lot of things, because many people, for a long time, we've sort of had this mentality of, the $15 minimum wage, but very slowly and subtly, that not a lot of people might have noticed, is that the, $15 minimum wage, even, nowadays, it ain't gonna cut it no more. So now, we need to raise that wage more. That was sort of the big problem with how Bernie Sanders ran that campaign, in the sense that he ran it as we need to raise the minimum wage to $15. But then many people assumed, that's just it. That's the end. Minimum wage needs to be raised to $15. Most missed that second part of his speech where he would go, and then we have to tie it to inflation, which is true. The minimum wage needs to be tied to inflation so that we don't have to worry about the minimum wage needing to be increased every so often. But then again, maybe 17 is too low, honestly. But, we need to, I'm pretty sure, you have to go baby step by baby step. But I think there just needs to be, we need to stop saying, a flat-out wage, and we just need to say, we need to tie the minimum wage to inflation. But then again, of course, you have to say, okay, but how are we going to tie it to inflation? You have to say a wage first, and then say, a broad living wage first, and then you have to tie it to inflation. But I remember, they were, in the 2020 cycle, we saw some candidates that were just flat, just saying, yeah, we just need to increase it to $20. And it's yeah, honestly, at that point, that's just fair. But that's sort of when you have to get in that debate about, we kind of need to do away with certain things, I remember seeing this thing where it's we need to just end every single number with money with a 5 or a 0. But that's, a whole different discussion. So let's just move on to the next thing. Big announcement coming from Texas. Colin Allred has announced a 2024 bid against Ted Cruz. Okay, so for those of you who have no clue who Colin Allred is a U.S. representative from Texas's 32nd Congressional District, starting in 2019 and, being around ever since. Now, what was interesting about him is that he actually beat a long-standing Republican in that seat. What is also interesting is that he used to be a linebacker for the Tennessee Titans. In fact, he wasn't even the only NFL player that made it to Congress that year. There was a Republican. I think his name was Anthony Gonzalez, who also won in that cycle. But one thing that is very interesting about Colin Allred is that he has a little bit of a reputation in sort of progressive tube or left tube. You might not remember this, but you might. Maybe if you pay attention to my Twitter feed, then you would remember this. But Colin Allred has this weird title of being the lost Justice Democrat. Let me explain. For his race in the 32nd District, he, very early on, he, was part of, the first round of slates, or, a second or third slate in the Justice Democrat field. He was endorsed by Justice Democrats when the race was beginning. But then, at some point during the race, he was silently dropped from the site. Now, that necessarily isn't that bad, but what's interesting is the fact that he was dropped from the site and then won. And then also, I should mention, he also really kind of shifted politically. The dude, I don't necessarily understand, when he ran as a progressive, obviously, but he hasn't really lived up to what he ran on initially, as he's a member of the New Democrat Coalition, and he's basically positioned himself a lot more moderate in the field. Even though he did run on Medicare for All when he first announced his rate, but he just kind of changed. What ended up happening? Why did he leave his side? Why did he go to be more moderate? Well, I think a lot of people blame it on Cenk Uygur and his whole fiasco, but maybe it was because early on Justice Democrats wasn't really that left wing. They were really very early on just basically they were literally basically just, oh, we reject corporate PAC money. Then it was a little bit later when they introduced a lot more of the progressive legislation that they like. And maybe he jumped on that trend when that was what it sort of became. But very early on, maybe he just thought, oh yeah, I'll just go on this thing and just announce that I'm against corporate PAC money. Now you might be wondering, why the heck is Colin Allred running in Texas, in the Texas Senate seat? Well, like I said, Colin Allred had previously beaten a long-standing Republican in a congressional seat. So he sees that is possible for him to do, beat a deep red seat. But also, the seat isn't as deep red as you would think. It has steadily shifted blue. Of course, it's not as to the point where it is literally blue is on the horizon. It's literally just it's just shifting to blue. Maybe he's trying to be the last push to get them to go full blue. I don't know. Many people are even saying it just makes sense for him to run because Resistor Dems just love Resistor Dem type stuff, and his first campaign ad was literally just pure Resistor Dem type vibes. Will he win? Probably not, but don't sleep on him. Speaking of a race that you shouldn't sleep on, Maryland, stunning announcement coming from Maryland. Benjamin Cardin has announced that he will retire from the Senate. The reason being, he's 79 years old, and he does not want to become the next Dianne Feinstein, which has opened up a deep blue seat to get a lot of people to run. Now, one thing that is interesting that I should mention is that Ben Cardin, he was the candidate that Chelsea Manning ran against in the last election. Very interesting. Maybe Chelsea should run for this cycle. Unlikely, but, that'd be kind of cool. But what is very interesting about this cycle is that, with this, you know what this means. Open primary. Everything's ready to go. And, in fact, a lot of people have already begun initiating bids. Literally, as soon as Cardin announced that he was retiring, 3 people entered the race. Will Jawando, a candidate for Maryland's 8th Congressional District in 2016, David Trone, another candidate in that seat, but is currently a U.S. representative, and lastly, that is most interesting, is Jerome Segal, who has announced that he will no longer be running for president, and instead run for the Senate seat instead. He's not going to win this race either, but, good effort. And I'm not immediately rushing to endorse Jerome Segal because there are actually some interesting candidates that might actually run for this race instead. Ones that I absolutely would not support, like John Delaney, Tom Perez, or John Carden. But then, here's one that is interesting. Ben Jealous. The candidate for governor that Democrats ran to not support due to the fact that they loved Larry Hogan so much. But the biggest prospect that I almost immediately just jumped on the wagon to that hasn't announced yet is Jamie Raskin from Maryland's 8th District. Jamie Raskin, I think really, honestly, Jamie Raskin's the one who's got it in the bag. Like, for real. Jamie Raskin, he literally just has it in the bag. He's a progressive candidate, obviously, but also, he very much has built himself in that sort of resistor lib type mentality. So again, very much perfect for that type of crowd. And if he announces very early on, he could very much silence the rest of the field because he has cancer. And it would be very, very suspect for someone to run against someone running with cancer. Raskin's currently in remission, obviously, thankfully. But, that would be very suspect for people to announce that they're going to be running against a guy who has cancer. Especially because he also has a lot of tragic life story, like his son is dead, very tragic. Honestly, I think he can get all of the groups of people to support him. He's got the resistor libs in the bag, he's got progressives in the bag, or at least I think that he would have progressives in the bag. Warren Dems, so progressives quote unquote, he has them in the bag because he's a Warren Dem. He could probably get sympathetic people who don't really care that much about politics. But we'll have to wait and see. I really hope Raskin runs. And with that, let's move on to the main topic of this video. I honestly did not expect this video to be around anymore. I honestly thought that you guys would want me to talk about the Turkish election more than this election. But I don't know if it's because people know that I know a lot more about Mexican politics, so I won't have to do that much research going into it, or if it's because, I don't know, I guess people just really wanted me to talk about the Mexican election. People weren't that interested in the Turkish election, I guess. Although I think maybe it's because the Turkish election, they thought this one might have a lot more impact, and the Turkish election, we don't know if that one will have much impact, because Turkish election, many people are suggesting that it probably will just be an Erdogan win. This one, let's just get into it. So, for those who don't know, Mexico, our neighbors to the south, have a very interesting, bout of elections. Now, they don't really have that many elections. They really only have 2 governorships up for election in the next cycle. But what's interesting is that these 2 elections are going to be the last 2 elections before Mexico has to gear up for the presidential election. Which means that there is a little bit of pressure on both sides of the aisle to make sure that these elections will go a certain way. In fact, many people see it as this could be the thing that shows how powerful or the opposition to AMLO is, or how powerful AMLO is, and that could very much sway how the next presidential election might play out, even if the results might not be that impressive. Alright, so first, let's just do a little bit of a breakdown of how the Mexican political scene is, both historically and currently. Now, Mexican politics is very similar to ours, but also a heck of a lot different. For starters, they have elements of proportional representation, which means that there are more parties representative in their chambers, but also very similar because of how, partisanly, you would think. They have the sort of same definitions of left and right a little bit, but they're a little bit more malleable sometimes. We get that into a tiny bit in this video, but also a lot of their divides seem to be personality-based. And nowhere is that more prevalent than in how the elections and how most Mexican politics is sort of broken down. You see, most of, historically, Mexican politics used to be very simple. For over 70 years, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI, basically controlled Mexico. There were no ifs, ands, or buts. They had basically complete control over Mexican politics. If you wanted to run in Mexican politics, you did it through the PRI. If you wanted to stand up on principles, you'd go with another party. But then what ended up happening is opposition to the PRI sort of grew, but it was sort of divided into right-wing opposition and left-wing opposition. The right-wing opposition was dominated by a party called the National Action Party, or PAN. Meanwhile, the left-wing opposition ranged from the Mexican Communist Party to more mainstream center-left social democratic groups. But they didn't really have that much political power until one election cycle, 1976, where the PRI ran literally unopposed. So there wasn't even a modicum of, oh, we have a functional democracy, but it just so happens that we win every single time. That was usually how they won before, where it's not technically a dictatorship, especially considering the PRI also launched some satellite parties that were basically puppets of them. But after literally no opposition candidate could mount a viable bid against the PRI was maybe we should actually start running our elections a bit more fairly, which is when they introduced their proportional representation, which led to parties from all across the political spectrum to start becoming part of politics in Mexico. Nowhere is that more evident than when you look at the parties by their birth years. The PRI was born in 1929, the National Action Party was born in 1939, and the first opposition party that actually managed to stick around to the common day outside of those two was born in 1989, a long period of time before any new mainstream party managed to get in, and even less with the rest of the parties who were either born in the 90s or the most recent one being born in 2011. But what this ended up doing is basically making Mexico a one-party plus system for a little while, where it's the PRI still had basically all of control, but a couple of other parties, they could still go around and maybe push something, but realistically the PRI still has power. But then the opposition just steadily started growing, one on the left, one on the right, and then the rest sort of representing their smaller interest groups. But then eventually, one day, the PAN managed to win the presidency. But all that really did was basically just switch the roles of the PRI and the PAN. Now all of a sudden the PAN was the mainstream party and the PRI was the opposition. Plus, I should also mention that not even all of the parties could remain unified. I guess I'll just mention this. One of the major opposition parties outside of the PAN, or the PRI in this instance, was the PRD, which sort of divided itself into three camps. One camp led by their founder, Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, another camp led by one of their other founders, Porfirio Muñoz Ledo, and then their third camp being led by a guy called Andrés Manuel López Obrador, each sort of having different ways on how they viewed politics. Cuauhtémoc was more of an old guard type, Porfirio Muñoz Ledo was a guy who was okay with working with the establishment, and AMLO was one of those extremely anti-establishment left populist types. But they were all sort of in that same social democratic type mindset. Really, the only difference between them was rhetoric and who they were okay with aligning with. But things didn't really start changing again for Mexico until the 2010s, when the mainstream elements of the PRD aligned themselves with the PAN and the PRI to push for something called the Pact for Mexico, which was essentially just them signing off on what the PRI and the PAN wanted to do in regards to certain things like energy, the biggest one being that Mexico has a nationalist petroleum industry, but the PAN, one of their main things, that they wanted to privatize it from day one, but the PRI then started getting some neoliberal elements, which meant that they started being okay with the idea of privatizing it, and now the PRI-RD basically just went ahead and signed off on the idea that we should privatize the state-run petroleum industry, Pemex. And AMLO was very mad, so he took his faction of the PRD and then left to form a brand new political party, and then he would end up winning the presidency under this banner called Morena, or the National Regeneration Movement. And really, not much has changed in regards to how Mexican politics is run, but what's changed is who is in what seat. So you see, because now at this point, Morena is the guys in charge, and now the opposition is the people on the right, which is the PRI and the PAN, but now the PRD, But then there's also someone who is, I guess, they're not really left-wing opposition to Morena, but they're more like, I guess, they're opposition, but in a different camp. I guess I should use this time to delve into the parties of the Mexican, like, political scene. Okay, so first we have the PRI and the PAN. The PRI is a sort of like your neoliberal centrist type party. The PAN is your more explicitly right-wing party, ranging from Christian democracy to full-blown conservatism. Then we have the PRD, which on paper is center-left social democratic, but ever since AMLO left, and then Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas would leave soon after, all of the actual momentum behind the PRD has sort of started like being sucked out. So they're still sort of lost and don't know what to do, which has led to them to starting to shift further to the right. One of the most interesting parties in Mexican politics is the Ecologist Green Party of Mexico, or PVEM. They are a center-right, green conservative political party. But what they've ended up doing to stay relevant is essentially just bend the knee to whoever is in charge. When the PRI was in charge, they were in alliance with the PRI. When the PAN was in charge, they were in alliance with the PAN. But now that Morena and AMLO are in charge, they're in an alliance with him. They really don't have that much of an ideology anymore, if they had any at all. Another smaller political party is the Labor Party of Mexico, or PT. They are the explicitly socialist party in Mexican politics. They've essentially aligned themselves with the furthest left element of Mexican politics for a while, but have been okay with aligning themselves with more center-left elements. Like, they were alliances with the PRD for a bit, they're in alliance with AMLO, etc. And while I'm here, I guess I should say AMLO's party, Morena, center-left to left-wing populist, pretty social democratic, but definitely with socialistic elements. Like, he's an anti-neoliberal type, and he has formed alliances with socialists, as I mentioned, with the PT, but I don't know if he himself is, like, explicitly socialist. But he has also formed alliances with the freaking Zapatistas, which are, like, a far left, like, anarchist faction, so it's like, maybe he is more socialist than he lets on. But the last major party in Mexican politics is the Citizens Movement, or Movimiento Ciudadano, or Movimiento Naranja. Their party was a strange one. You see, back in the day, they were sort of like what was considered, like, they're like another social democratic party in Mexican politics, but they've sort of transitioned away from that. Not as much as the PRD has, maybe as much as the PRD has, but they have shifted away from sort of being like somewhat left-wing. Like, they claim to still somewhat be left-wing, but they sort of have now positioned themselves as more of a centrist faction, you know, whereas Morena and his party are now representative of the Mexican political left, and the Va por Mexico alliance, which is the PRD, PRI, and PAN, represent the right side of the aisle. Now, the Citizens Movement have established themselves as like, we are in between these two people. They don't align themselves with AMLO, aside from certain legislation that they want him to pass. And they don't align themselves with the opposition because they still want to maintain good relations with AMLO. But they were originally formed as sort of like, oh, the PRD are sort of like old, crotchety old men. They really don't represent what the modern day people need. Like, they're very hyper-focused on social issues. That's one of their bread and butters. Like, social issues are very important to them. Occasionally in Mexican politics, you'll get a party jump in here and there, and then they'll disappear and remain, like, prominent on the state level. But otherwise, those are really the mainstream political forces in Mexico. The only other one that I should mention is the Social Encounter Party, but that's because the Social Encounter Party was in an alliance with AMLO in the last presidential election, and they managed to win a governor under that election, and that governor has still remained a member of the Social Encounter Party. I guess with that, I'll just mention the gubernatorial breakdown of Mexico. Mexico has 32 states, and of those 32 states, 2 are up for election. The state of Mexico and the state of Coahuila. Both of those are currently pre-governorships, and the PRI currently has 3 governorships. So let's just remove 2 of them for that and just say the PRI has 1. And the PES and PVEM also have 1 governorship. The Citizen Movement has 2 governorships, the PAN has 5, and Morena has the remaining 20. So right off the bat, Morena's already in a pretty hefty lead. In fact, seeing that on election day, just all of those Morena maps like going really big, love to see it. That was the first big test, but this is the last test. It's not really a big test, but this is the last one. So it is warranted to see how Morena could do in these 2 upcoming elections. And I'll use that time afterwards to briefly delve into the Mexican presidential election, because we're still a ways away from that, but we're at the point where we can start looking into it a bit more seriously. The first thing that I should mention that is very interesting about these current gubernatorial elections is one thing that does show one of the party's elements. The Citizens Movement has made the decision that they will not run a candidate in either state election. And that is incredibly important for a couple of reasons. One of the biggest ones is that in the lead up to this election, the big anti-AMLO coalition that I mentioned before, they just dissolved because the PRI signed on to a piece of legislation that AMLO wants, a security bill, and the whole point of the pact was that, like, oh, we're not going to give AMLO any W's. And what happened in the last election cycle also showed that this is basically what the Citizens Movement is doing for this cycle. This is the other half of the strategy of licking their finger and seeing where the wind blows. See, because the last cycle, they announced they weren't going to be forming an alliance with the PRD, the PAN, and the PRI. They were saying, like, no, that's just off the table. And this one is because they are not going to run candidates at all. Now, what is interesting about that is that there was actually leaked documents that AMLO showed that showed, like, the mainstream media in America were trying to amplify and push for all 4 of the Mexican opposition parties to form a massive anti-AMLO coalition. And as we see, a couple of them listened, but the Citizens Movement didn't. And in the lead up to the presidential election, we've seen a lot of people from the mainstream, like those 3 parties, like form like groups and talk about like potentially running for president. But the Citizens Movement has always tried to keep their presidential speculation separate, even though there has been overlap between certain candidates for the Citizens Movement and the like massive anti-AMLO coalition, basically saying there is one person who is a Citizens Movement candidate that could be perfect for the anti-AMLO coalition because of his massive profile. But it looks like they might actually be waiting. They want to see if this massive anti-AMLO coalition will work. Like they wanted to see it in the last cycle, and they want to see it for this cycle. They want to see if it can work. If it can work, they would probably be more open to running candidates against AMLO openly and joining this alliance. But they're playing their cards right. They know that this opposition coalition is bad. People don't like that coalition. So they're trying to paint themselves again as the spirited, actual opposition to AMLO. A big one again would be harping on those social issues, because those ones are where even people who like AMLO, like myself, that would actually give like criticisms of AMLO. And I guess one more thing I should say before I finally get into like the actual elections is this might be the last election cycle where we go by the current cycle of how elections work in Mexico, because AMLO's been trying to change the election system for a bit, but it's very unlikely to pass because it's not really that popular. So let's just go into how this will go. Okay, so June 4th is when the state of Mexico and the state of Coahuila will be voting on who their next governor is. The campaign will remain until the 31st of May, after which the campaign will go radio silent. And I mean that literally, because I remember, like, this is how it works in Mexico. Like, they give you a certain campaign duration, and then after that campaign duration is done, all of your campaign stuff is shut down. Like, they post on their Twitter saying, like, yeah, we're grateful for your support, but now we have to go radio silent until the results come in, and then their campaign websites get shut down. Very efficient, honestly. We will start off with the state of Mexico, where this one is a pretty simple election, because we have 2 candidates representing the 2 coalitions. Alejandro de Moral Vela, representing the Va por Mexico coalition, and Delfina Gomez Alvarez, representing the Together We Make History coalition, which is AMLO's coalition. Alejandra, better known as Ale de Moral, was her state's Secretary of Social Development under the current governor, Alfredo del Mazo Maza, who is a PRI person, and she is also a member of the PRI. Delfina, on the other hand, has had a more national known career, being a senator from the state of Mexico from September 1st, 2018 to December 2nd, 2018, and September 7th, 2022 to January 1st, 2023, being AMLO's Secretary of Public Education from February 16th, 2021 to September 1st, 2022, as well as being a member of the Chamber of Deputies, on and off from September of 2015 to August of 2018. She also served as the municipal president of Texcoco. She originally was an independent, but then after Morena got off the ground in 2015, she decided to join them instead. And due to the fact that she's a more national figure, she's gotten into a little bit more scrutiny, mostly dealing with money. First is her collections of teeths, which is essentially a tax that is then used to finance activities that are not necessarily tax-worthy, I guess. In this case, she had taken 10% of the salary of the workers in her Texcoco municipality and had financed them into Morena, and as a consequence, Morena was fined 4,529,222 pesos. But in January of 2022, she was exonerated from it, saying that there was no specific or direct benefit that was put in her favor. There were also accusations that she was paying herself salaries of over 217,000 pesos, and she went on to state that it was actually the law that permits her to do so, but this even goes so far as to her position as Secretary of Public Education, where apparently irregularities that amounted up to 83 million pesos were missing during her tenure as secretary. There was also an issue that went under the state that she allocated a lot of money to a program called the School is Ours program, but then they looked into it and were like, this really doesn't seem like it's actually improving our schools, which, I mean, let's be real, that's a little bit odd. But then many people would make the argument oh, this doesn't matter because under the PRI and the PAN, this is the same thing, but they're only bringing the scrutiny up because she's part of the Morena government, which is I guess that's true. It's still kind of weird, and I wouldn't support it if I were in the position, but whatever. Polling-wise, this race seems to be a done deal. Throughout the entire election cycle, Gomez has managed to win against Del Moral, usually getting, the latest poll has her at 48.9% and Del Moral at 37.8%, and the people who chose anything else, we don't support any of them, or I don't know, is 13.3%. And let's be real, if all of the polls that have, all of the middle grounds are in the double digits with the exception of, one or two. So, and the margin of error is really small because I think this area is a swing seat. It's one of those ones where it's we don't necessarily know what is going to happen for the time being. We'll just have to wait and see how things pan out. But this election, this other one, actually is a bit more interesting of a campaign, and the reason why is if you pay attention to the thumbnail, you'll notice that there's a couple more people on the one of the sides than the other side. This race, in fact, has 4 candidates running. First, we have Manolo Jimenez Salinas, a PRI person running under an alliance called the Citizen Alliance for Security. Don't let the name fool you, it's just the Va por Mexico Alliance again. Since we spent all that time talking about a Morena person, let's talk about Manolo for a little bit. He was the Secretary of Inclusion and Social Development in Coahuila and was the municipal president of Saltillo and is a Mexican businessman. As such, he's also gotten into a little bit of controversy. From the looks of it, it seems that his biggest problem seems to be he seems to be getting money, but he never actually tells you where that money comes from. So basically, it showed that a lot of resources that he claimed to have invested were not verified, and that his wife, Paola Rodriguez Lopez, did not report the origin of the resources delivered to places in the city where it was proven that the government did so in the hands of her husband. So basically, it was like he's using government things to like push money and help his own interests. And another interesting thing happened that, like, when a house exploded, that they had involvement in building, and the people who were in the explosion sued them because they argued that, in actuality, the house would have been around if they had actually had foundation, but these guys weren't giving them proper foundation. So this guy is kind of suspect. The next candidate is interesting. His name is Lenin Perez Rivera, a Mexican politician who served as the deputy from the 1st District of Coahuila from September 2018 to August 2021, and served as the municipal president of Acuña, originally serving as a member of the National Action Party, but is currently running this election as a member of the Democratic Unity of Coahuila candidate, a center-left political party. See, this is what I mentioned before. Mexican political parties, they have this sort of weird thing where sometimes you will have people that run like as members of the Labor Party, but then the next cycle they will run as members of the PAN, or vice versa. It's quite an interesting endeavor. But now you might be wondering, what about the Together We Make History coalition? Well, that's where things get a heck of a lot more complicated. There were a lot of people that had been talking about the idea of running with this coalition. The 4 finalists were delegate of the development programs Reyes Flores Hurtado. There was the former federal deputy Luis Fernando Salazar Fernandez, the former undersecretary of Citizen Security Ricardo Mejia Berdeja, and incumbent Senator Armando Guadiana Tijerina. And what ended up happening is that Armando ended up being chosen as the party's nominee. Now, Armando, he hasn't always been a member of Morena. He was originally a member of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, a party that he remained in until 2012. Then his first forte into public office since then was him being a member of the National Regeneration Movement, obviously. And things were going good until one of his opponents, Ricardo Mejia Berdeja, was absolutely mad at the prospect of him being a member of this coalition, calling him the model candidate for the PRI and openly refusing to back him. For starters, there was a very obvious partisan difference between the two candidates. You see, let's look at the parties of, like, Berdeja as for comparison. Yes, he was a member of the PRI for a little bit, but it was only until 1997. Then in 1999, he turned his party affiliation to the PRD. Then in 2011, he changed his party affiliation to the Citizens Movement. Then in 2018, he had officially become a member of Morena, which, while technically a longer period of time outside of Morena, he has been more consistently alongside left-wing parties in his endeavors, and he had claimed that the party had played favoritism to Armando and had been not so nice to him, even though he was a more national figure, even part of AMLO's cabinet. And as a response to him loudly decrying his state party for all of this, AMLO made the decision to remove Mejia Berdeja as the Undersecretary of Public Security. And when he did his morning conference on the 16th, 3 days after he removed Berdeja from his position, AMLO stated, quote, Mejia didn't even say goodbye when he left office. And Mario Delgado, the leader of Morena, was saying that Mejia Berdeja is biting the hand that fed him, basically saying he is burning all the bridges that he has. And this isn't uncommon, because many people in Morena, due to the fact that Mexico has a lot more of an open, many other parties that are running in the contention, more people in the parties are open to the idea of leaving and joining other parties. We had a lot of people who were Morena candidates in the last cycle who, after not getting the nominations for their governorships, decided to run under a new party. I think a majority of them literally just flipped to join the Force for Mexico, which was this new party that just popped in out of nowhere. And then they left as soon as they appeared. Then what ended up happening is Mejia Verdeja decided to start talking with PVEM and PT with the idea of maybe he could run as their candidate. What ended up happening is that PVEM decided to shift their support to Lenin, and PT decided to go ahead and give Mejia their nomination. Now let's look over as to why the two people on the left side of the aisle, I guess, would not like each other. Mejia, of course, saying he's the model candidate of the PRI, but what does he mean by that? Well, I think it has to do with all of the corruption scandals surrounding Armando. He appeared in the Pentagon Papers, founding a trust that protects 50,000 shares of a company located in the British Virgin Islands, part of a network that uses tax havens to hide undeclared fortunes. In 2020, an investigation revealed that 4 companies belonging to Armando were listed as suppliers to the Federal Electricity Commission, which Armando would earn at least 57.9 million pesos if the companies were hired. In 1993, he was imprisoned for tax fraud, and in 2012, the Attorney General began an investigation to look into whether or not he has ties to organized crime, an investigation that is still ongoing. Now, before you say, man, that's a bit shady, it's a good thing the left has another candidate to run with, I wouldn't be so sure about that. In July of 2022, Ricardo Mejia was accused of maintaining an alliance with various leaders and drug traffickers in Mexico, associating with a lawyer that was the brother of the head of a cartel. And in October of that year, one of the people who was touting Mejia's candidacy was assassinated by a member of a different cartel when they were going to meet with each other. He's also been linked to another drug cartel who has been one of the main financiers of political campaigns in the north of Mexico. And un-cartel-related controversies came from the fact that, allegedly, during his tenure as undersecretary, a permit was issued for a company in charge of security during a fire that killed 40 migrants. So yeah, this one isn't really that much of a victory. These ones aren't really necessarily people that I'm rooting for. But no worries about that, because according to this one is safe green. Jimenez basically has this election in the bag. The only poll that I've seen that has any other candidate winning was done in January of 2023, which had Guadiana with a slim lead over Jimenez. What is interesting is many people might say this might actually be because of Mejia, because almost a lot of the polls that have been done show that he is sort of look at this. The most recent poll, Guadiana 28%, Jimenez 38%, Perez 4%, Mejia 19%, margin of error 4.9. I'm going to take a wild guess and say that Mejia might be blamed for the election loss of Guadiana. So yeah, like I said, the results of the election are actually not that impressive, honestly. One is seen as basically Morena easy win, and the other one is seen as basically pre-easy win. This one really isn't changing that much of how the election might plan out in the future. It would only change if it were both of the part, for example, let's say Mejia actually manages to pull through, because that is possible. Because there was one state, Nuevo Leon, where it was everybody was expecting a Pri or Morena or PAN, but then lo and behold, PVEM somehow managed to squeeze in that election, and the Citizens Movement also did the same thing. Maybe this one could be a PT victory. That's the only reason I could see hypothetically backing Mejia, because just the idea of having a PT victory would be kind of cool. I don't think PT is I think the only party in the modern day of Mexico that doesn't have a governorship or hasn't won a governorship at least once. Currently the PRD, they don't have any governors either, but that's because nobody cares about them anymore. And with that, I guess I'll briefly talk about the upcoming presidential election. As you see, that one doesn't really have that much of a, like, what happens next. Like, that doesn't really have that much of a upcoming vibe for the next upcoming Mexican presidential election. That one's not really changing much. But many people are wondering, what will happen for the next Mexican presidential election? But the first thing I should mention is the fact that AMLO cannot run for another term, because in Mexico, the rule is you can only run for one presidential term, and that's it. We learned that from the fact that Mexico had one president for 32 uninterrupted years. They learned maybe we shouldn't have him be the president anymore, and we should prevent this from happening again. And AMLO, despite what many people think, has actually maintained a relatively high approval rating. That number I have him hold in the thumbnail, 62%, that is his approval rating, and that is the highest of any Mexican president at this point in their tenure. It's not really that impressive, but comparatively to other world leaders at the current year and Mexican presidents, yeah, that is rather impressive. The real question is, who will be the next president of Mexico? We've had quite a number of people floated, and I can't really get into all of them here and there, but to just briefly say, on the likelihood of each party attaining the presidency, from bottom to top, PRD, PVEM, PT, MC, PAN, Morena. Like, logistically, Morena's probably going to win. Like, logistically, as far as I can tell, I think Morena has the next election potentially in the bag. The election after that, I don't know. But, like, it would really have to depend on what the next, like, election entails. Because we're already seeing a lot of names being thrown out, obviously. But there really aren't that many people that I can actually see potentially becoming president. And some prospects are taken a lot more seriously than others. Now let me answer some questions. Will the coalitions be around for the next election? Well, considering the fact that the Va por Mexico election literally rejoined just before the upcoming presidential election, I'm going to take a wild guess and say that maybe they will be around for the next election. And while I'm at it, I should say this. There is no scenario where there is no coalitions. I've seen some people float that idea, but realistically there will be the AMLO coalition and the anti-AMLO coalition. Will MC join in one of the coalitions? That I don't know. I honestly can't decide whether or not they would or would not. It would probably have to depend on... If they manage to beat AMLO in both of these gubernatorial ones, then they probably will. But they very much seem to be in the route of trying to go it alone. They want to set themselves apart from the mainstream Mexican political establishment, but also obviously want to divide themselves from Morena. Would there be any other party in this upcoming election? Possible, but I don't really necessarily see any new force entering the scene. Like, realistically, like, I mean, we do see this sometimes. Like, there'll be, like, in the 2012 election, we had, like, the New Alliance movement become, like, a decently fourth place candidate. And then in the 2018 election, we had Jaime Calderon and Bronco enter the scene out of nowhere. But, yeah, out of nowhere, we'd have to find out. We'd have to wait and see if there would be a new person entering the scene. I don't think it's likely. Now, who would each coalition nominate? That's where it gets even more tricky. I guess we'll start off with the Citizens Movement. The Citizens Movement really only has 3 people that are being put into contention. First, we have their 2 governors, the governor of Jalisco, Enrique Alfaro Ramirez, whose term will be up when the next election rolls around. He was who they initially sought to make their candidate, but ever since 2 more people entered the scene, he's sort of been pushed into the backside. The 2 people in question being the governor of Nuevo León, Samuel Garcia. I should mention that, yeah, Nuevo León was the one where the MC person won. The San Luis Potosi was where the Green Party person ran. And the mayor of Monterrey. I can't roll my tongue. I fail in that attempt every single time, but I have to show something to indicate that it's a rolled tongue. Luis Donaldo Colosio Riojas. And if that name sounds a little bit familiar, that's because he is the son of the pre-presidential candidate that was assassinated I would have to say those two would probably be in my top 10 on who could be the next president of Mexico. Luis Donaldo Colosio especially, because he is being floated as a potential mediator between the mainstream opposition and the citizens movement. He's the only person that could be the bridge. The Va por Mexico coalition? Initially, I was thinking that Ricardo Anaya would be the candidate that would be the most likely to run in the upcoming election, but recently he's gotten into a lot of legal troubles that prevent him from even stepping foot in Mexico, so I don't necessarily know how he would be a viable candidate. Now, Margarita Zavala has re-entered the scene. She tried to run as an independent candidate in the last presidential cycle, because she was like, oh, this party is too rigid and formulaic. I should run and be my own candidate. And she was also snubbed for the presidential contention because she was the first lady of an incredibly unpopular president. So she re-entered the party, and now she might be in contention for their nomination. There is another female, Lily Diaz, a senator that could be an interesting candidate. She seems to be the most likely female candidate. Recently, Santiago Creel actually somehow trended on Twitter, which means that he probably has a bot army, but it could also mean that there are people who could take his candidacy more seriously. But all those people were from the pan. If I wanted to give a pre-person any indication that they could be president, it would be Alfredo del Mazo Maza, who, as I mentioned, is also going to be a governor that won't be in contention. And the Morena, well, let's be real. In Morena, there are really only two people that are being looked at as serious presidential contenders. Marcelo Ebrard, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and the Mayor of Mexico City, Claudia Sheinbaum. And everybody's made it pretty clear that if push came to shove, they would go with Sheinbaum over Marcelo. And when you put her against any of their candidates, she polls incredibly higher than Marcelo Ebrard. If I had to put actual money, I would say one of those two will be president of Mexico. Let's be real. But we still have a ways to go. Technically, we don't have anybody who has actually even formally entered the race. Well, we sort of have this thing, because in Mexico we have this thing called the pre-candidates. Well, they have this thing called the pre-candidates. I'm not in Mexico. But they have the pre-candidates where they have to formally, it's basically the primary process, except they have to do all the stuff even before they start doing anything. So we'll have to wait and see how the Mexican election pans out. I'm genuinely excited to see what happens next. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and click the bell to notify when a future video of mine comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, you can go to my website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, or consider supporting me on Patreon.